The Perfect Storm was written by Sebastian Junger and it was published by the HarperCollins Publishers in 1997. So the author Sebastian Junger, he had no relation to science, but his father introduced him to the sea, which led him to dedicate this book to his father when Junger learned about the story of the men on the ship of the Andrea Gail, which interested him because at the time he was living in Massachusetts and it prompted him to do his research and share the story about Hurricane Grace and the men who encountered it. The book takes place in Massachusetts in 1991, as well as in the North Atlantic Ocean and on the ship the Andrea Gail, which is a fishing boat. There are many characters in this book, including the six men who were on the Andrea Gail, who are Billy Tyne, Bugsy Moran, Alfred Pierre, Bobby Shatford, David Sullivan, and Murph. It also shares the stories of the family members of the men who were on the ship, as well as it includes the owner of the ship, Bob Brown, and the Coast Guard and other military members who were trying to save the men on the ships. The book also includes the other boats as well as their crews, including the boats the Hannah Bowden, the Mary T, and the Canyon Explorer. So, the book starts by explaining the day-to-day descriptions of the fishermen and their jobs, much centered around being at the Crow's Nest, which was the bar they spent most of their time at when they were not fishing. It goes on to explain the true story of the crew members of the Andrea Gail and the other fishing boats who are just going on their monthly fishing voyage to make a profit, who end up encountering the severe conditions of Hurricane Grace, which unfortunately was not known at the time. They were just longline fishing for swordfish in the ocean. It also explains the story of the military members who were trying to save the fishermen in the storm, as well as what the military men have to encounter and the strategic options they take and execute when trying to save the men at sea. The book also shares the stories about what the Andrea Gail's crew members, family, and loved ones had to go through during this time of uncertainty. I learned a lot of information from this book, including a lot of facts and information about fish, mainly swordfish because that's what they were fishing. So I learned that swordfish feed at night, and I learned that in the food chain, it tends to collect between layers of warm and cold water. So squid feed on cold water plankton, and swordfish feed on squid, meaning that a lot of times the swordfish were found in the cold water. I also learned that the National Marine Fisheries Service required all boats to be registered and to report their catches. I learned a lot of information about hurricanes also. There's a such thing called a cutoff low or an occluded front, which means air gets sucked in toward the center of the storm and the system spins faster and faster, resulting in the major storm. I also learned that hurricanes start in lukewarm waters around the equator and they start with a disturbance in the trade winds. Once water is evaporated into the air from the sunlight, the evaporated water is unstable and contains strong energy. Warm air is less dense than cold air, so when it rises off the surface of the ocean, it cools the upper atmosphere and then it dumps the moisture. This creates huge cumulus clouds developing over the zones of rising air. And this leads to heavy rain, thunder, and lightning, which is the storm. So, some information about the Hurricane Grace, that was in the book, includes what they first saw was the backing wind, which a backing wind is the first distant touch of a low pressure system, which is going into a cyclonic spin. The waves during the time of the hurricane reached almost up to 100 feet high, and the wind speeds were up to 120 miles per hour. The hurricane was considered a Force 12 hurricane. So for the analysis part, the main objectives of the written work were to share the story of the crew members of the Andrea Gail and the others who encountered the storm, but to also share about hurricanes and storms and give information about them so people are aware of what they can actually cause. These objectives were definitely accomplished because the book truly explained the story of everyone, especially the crew members of the Andrea Gail, who were trying to survive Hurricane Grace and what the conditions of the storm were. So, a lot of what the author shared worked well, especially describing and researching the effects of a hurricane and the different aspects of a hurricane, allowing the reader to understand what one might actually be like. There was overall one major theme of the book, and that was to never give up and always keep on fighting. Especially when the odds are completely against you, you never want to quit and always keep fighting, just like all the people at sea did, as well as the military members who were trying to help and save the fishermen during this hurricane. The intended audience could be a variety of people, anyone from storm chasers to fishermen, or anyone interested in a really good and compelling read, as well as anyone who was interested in informational books because it was very informational about storms and hurricanes. So I originally didn't have much previous thought on the topic because I wasn't very educated on the topic and I didn't know much about it. So I didn't have any changes in previous ideas I held on the topic, but now I am definitely much more aware of the impacts and the disastrous effects of a hurricane and what one can cause and all the issues it can lead to. I would definitely recommend this book to anyone because it was very informative about storms. It was also very intriguing and always kept you wondering what was going to happen next. There were definitely a lot of cliffhangers at the end of the chapters, and it kept the reader very interested the entire time. The book was very, very informative, and I definitely learned a lot about storms. And anyone who's interested in storms should definitely read this book because it's a very good read. So, overall, The Perfect Storm by Sebastian Junger was a very good book and about the story of the crew members, mainly of the Andrea Gale, but also the other fishermen who encountered Hurricane Grace, as well as the military men who were trying to save the lives of the fishermen, and everything they all encountered and the disastrous effects of the entire storm and everything that everyone had to go through. Not even just the fishermen at sea or the military members, but also the waiting that the family members had to do on land, unsure of what was happening and what was going on. So, by sharing the story of all the men out at sea during those days who were trying to survive the severe conditions of Hurricane Grace, the author was able to fully accomplish his purposes of sharing those stories and information about hurricanes. He also was able to fully explain and support his major theme of never giving up, and for his intended audience of anyone who could either be like a storm chaser, a fisherman, or anyone interested in such a good and intriguing read, or anyone interested in any informational books. So I do recommend that anyone who gets the opportunity should definitely read The Perfect Storm because they'll be hooked instantly.